Welcome to another episode of the Best Book Club, the podcast where I discuss the best stories with the best minds in the community. I'm your host, Seselim, aka NeufAtora, and this episode I'm talking with a man who needs no introduction but deserves the best, a man of many words and ideas, most revolving around wedgies and hot cheerleaders, a pillar of and one of the most important people in the community, Hans Gutherson. Thank you so much for coming on once again.
Oh, I'm blushing. What a stellar intro as always. Thank you so much, my friend.
I told you you'd like
Great
it.
Great to be back again. Yes. Excellent.
So this episode will be a little different. It's not necessarily talking about stories, which I've kind of made my tagline, but it'll be a little. It's something that I think has been a long time coming. I guess first of all, you've written two of the most revered stories in the community, Lucy and Danielle and YWNR. And you've done your own podcast, Wedgie Talk. You've done plenty of contests, and you've done so much for this community, and you produce so much content. And yet, despite all of these interviews and everything that you've done, you have never been interviewed. And so I want to crack open that can of worms and see what comes out of it.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to steal your thunder, but I mean, the Unwashed Marxist did, when he started his podcast, talk to me, and he did a sort of an interview. And I mean, I do have the distinction of being like the first ever wedgie fetishist to be sort of interviewed in a podcast format, which was partly the inspiration for my own. Years back, a user whose name was like Tiger Zero, no, Lepardo or Leopard Zero. I don't even know if he was in the community to this day, but he started a podcast that talked to different DA creators, and somehow I ended up on his radar. I'm guessing he had the fetish, and that's why I talked to him. But that was several years back now, and I've tried finding that file, and it's disappeared. So what we do have, though, is like Max has also gotten rid of his episode. Mm-hmm. So after this is done, you will have the only existing file of an interview with Hans Gutherson. So very cool stuff. And it's been a while. So I'm always excited to talk, and I'm really honored you would want to chat with me.
Absolutely, yeah. As much as you want to come on, and that's why I said this will be technically the first interview with you, because no other interview still exists today.
Yes, yeah, totally.
And it will be the most comprehensive to date.
Oh, amazing! I love it.
So, when did you first come into this fetish?
Wow, going right back to the roots. I love it.
Gotta start at the beginning.
Let's dial back. Yeah, let's start at the beginning. Great place to start, as always. So, for me, it was this gradual sort of process of understanding and realization, which I imagine it must be for most fetishists. But for me, it occurred around, I want to say, grade 8, and that's a little vague. It was definitely around grade 7 or 8 when I started realizing what it was. And when I say that's vague, I mean because grade 8 probably means something different to different countries and things. But I guess that puts me in around, 13 or something? 12 or 13, around there. It's close enough for government work, as Stephen King would say. And I began to realize, I was into this thing, and it's hard to sort of recall exactly how that realization came about. But I know seeing the cartoons, as is often the case for fetishists, like the Fairly Odd Parents is definitely one, and Lizzie McGuire, Kim Possible, like all these cartoons that were big when we were young, and even like Canadian made, since I'm Canadian, I want to give them a shout out, shows like 16.
Yes.
And many of these clips are around that. That had some, and so I feel like seeing all that at these very formative years of my life, around like 13, something like that, it locked in for me this fetish. I'm sort of the mind that's how it starts. That it's both a psychological and also environmental basis for it. So then I start and I discover the Wedgie Girls website, and I'm on there, and I'm reading like the Kim Possible stories and things, and I'm getting more and more into the fetish as it goes. But it really is this gradual sort of move into it, and I know, and I haven't thought about this in a while, but I know as I sort of started to realize like other people were into more vanilla things, I was like, wow, this is very weird and I'm strange and this is bad. So I think I somehow went about trying to like repress the fetish in my mind. And I've talked a bit about this before, but it was basically me trying never to think about it, trying to think about other stuff. And then I did get to a point where I'm pretty sure I had sort of forgotten like about wedgies, weirdly, as weird as that is to me now to think about. But I'd somehow managed it for a while, and then I sort of like forced myself to remember. I was like, "What wasn't there this thing I was really into? What was it?" And it somehow clicked again that it was wedgies. So it was this very like slow process, but definitely starts around that age of sort of puberty as fetishist and as sort of sexual desires, I should say, come into focus for people.
Nice. Yeah, I do wonder if that would be an interesting topic of because so many like the audience for for those cartoons was enormous, and so many of those people that watch those are not in this community. So I wonder if there
Yeah,
is something to
exactly.
it that like something in our DNA or something that we're predisposed to
That's the perfect word
be
choice
part of it.
too. Yeah, that's the perfect word choice. Predisposed. I think so. Like I've done a bit of reading into it. I'm obviously no psychologist, and I've started very briefly to write like an essay on the psychology of fetishists. But basically, at this point, it's just a survey of like how in the '60s they thought fetishists, like Freud thought it had to do with because we were afraid of phallic symbols in our mom's vagina or something. Like it's very bizarre stuff that
Yeah,
to
that
me
is
makes
weird.
no sense nowadays.
Yeah.
It was very weird. If you read any of his stuff, you see it in any sort of analysis of his stuff. It doesn't make any sense to me. I'm like, I'm not scared of like vagina or like I don't think of like my mom doesn't have a penis and that scares me. Like that's basically what his argument was. It's like we don't understand how people can't have penises. So I'm like, no, that's not it, Freud. Good try though. But for me it's sort of when I learned a bit about psychology in high school mostly because when I went to journalism school and university there was like none of that but in high school, so again, just to contextualize, like I'm no expert on this, the idea that came up again and again was that for mental illnesses, although I don't consider the fetish that at all, to clarify,
Oh
I just
yeah.
mean for sort of like mental issues, which I guess a fetish is, you could argue, whatever.
Maybe.
For
I don't think so.
simplification case, it's something in the brain, just to keep it very simple. Like it's
I
not a
guess.
problem, not an issue, whatever. Um, it is both a combination of environmental factors and predisposition. Obviously, of course, with anything, there's schools of thought who think like all mental issues are environmental or they're all psychological. But yeah, exactly what you said, right? Like I think about how many people would have seen these cartoons growing up around our age, but there aren't like not all the people and friends I grew up with or relatives who watch the show are wedgie fetishes, as far as I know, unless they're secretly wedgie fetishes
Right.
and no one's told me or something, which would be a great story idea. Um, the whole world is a fetish and we just don't know it yet. So I imagine it must be some combination of there's something with us specifically in our brains, and then so for whatever reason, when we see these things, the fetishes, the wedgies, sorry, on TV, it triggers something. So
Yeah.
I believe that's how it came about for me, and makes sense when I think about like, yeah, I start with the cartoons, and then obviously I go into the infamous self wedgie phase, as I call it, for a little bit.
That we've
Around
all
that
gone
age.
through.
Exactly. That's why it's infamous. And then I did have some stories I briefly shared about a relative and being like a very manipulative fetishist, which I think we maybe some of us do as well, trying to like get them to give me wedgies and things like that, which I definitely like regret now. And but I was younger then, so I think I can like get away with some of what what nowadays I think fetish mining is sort of the term that's arisen, where it's
Hmm.
like and you see it a lot on social media, right? The cliche of like somebody makes a post about wedgies or something, like someone not in the
Yeah.
community, then they get spammed a billion times by like a ridiculous number of wedgie fetishists who find them and who
Yeah.
like crawl and beg for more content, quote
Yep.
unquote. So I mean, I was sort of like that for a bit. Like, I was into chess when I was younger, and I still am. I should say I'm into chess, but I played it when I was younger, and I would go on sites like chess.com, and they used to have like a chat message box, and I would post in there like, "Does anyone know what a wedgie is?" I mean, like ridiculous stuff when I was very young and stuff. So I mean, just being like horny young teen who doesn't know any better. So like I
Yep.
sort of get where some of those people are coming from nowadays when they're just like spamming and stuff. And I mean, they
Yeah.
just don't know any better. But that was me. I was a fetishist who didn't know any better for a while.
So I guess you could say that we are something about us is just better than everyone else.
We are special. I love that. Yeah, totally.
um. All right. I guess this kind of goes hand in hand with that previous question. You might have answered some of it. How did you discover you were into wedgies in the first place?
Yeah, I think it's this weird thing of like I guess thinking about it probably like after seeing the cartoons I believe like really scraping my memory for this. I believe it's a case of like thinking a lot about it, having it on my mind, wanting to like do it and have like people give them to me and give them to others, and realizing like there's something more to this, and then finding the content, and then I think it's a slow process of discovering after all that of sort of manipulating to get them and having them on my mind so much that like I must be into this at a certain point when you begin to think about like what are you into, and as those sort of desires and understanding of like this is a sexual thing take shape for most people. I assume it's like, oh, boobs and breasts and women, whatever. For me it was like very clearly became like, oh yeah, I must be into this thing sexually.
I,
So yeah, and
hmm.
then definitely like being on Lucky Fetish forums. After I was on Widgie Girls, like I said, for a little bit before that site went down back in 2011. It was cementing all that, and still, even there, I was like reading stories, and then slowly coming to understand, like, yeah, I'm getting like turned on by this stuff, seeing videos like the early AR videos of Fox, Lindsay,
Yep.
and Stacy and stuff. And that was when I sort of like jerked off to that for the first time, which
Uh
was
huh.
in high school, and like and it's later than other people were getting off to things. I realized like yeah, like there's no question, like I'm into this, and that's that. A slower than others, I'm sure, to like sexually develop, but
Yeah.
it's about that's sort of the long answer. I hope
Eh,
to that question.
yeah. And also the whatever that woman's name is, the hanging wedgie.
Like the crane one,
No,
that
well
that
that one, but
crane.
but not that's not the
Yeah,
one I
I
was
remember
talking
that.
about.
Okay.
The one on the bunk bed.
Yeah,
Whatever
I
that
think I know what you're talking about. There was
it's
a lot around that. There
woman's
was a
name
group
hanging wedgie.
Tory. Oh, okay,
No,
okay. Because there was like the Tory stuff that was
nah, that wasn't
around
it.
at the same time. Yeah, I remember all that
I
stuff.
keep thinking it's like an S, but it's alright. You're a writer at heart. Why
Yeah.
did you start writing stories?
Wow. So that goes way back to the beginning. Before I was ever writing any wedgie stories, I was always into writing, big time. I grew up reading a lot, a lot, a lot. Like, and my dad got me into it when I was very young. He was big into reading, but he didn't do a lot. Like personal, getting really personal. He's like half blind. He lost his sight. I guess not super young, but unless you wanted me to talk about some of that, I'll speed through some of it. Just point is, he got me into reading when I was very young, and I did a lot of reading from a young age, and from that I sort of realized like, yeah, I wanted to express my creativity through writing. So I was pretty quick to start doing that in different forms. When I was younger, I made like little comic books. of like superheroes and things because my dad was also into
Wow.
comics. So and then totally wedgie free stuff, right? Like absolutely
Yep.
no wedgies to be seen anywhere. But I would draw, and I still suck to this day at drawing. But I did like a little bit of art where like I would draw like stick figures of different superheroes, very like Jesse from Breaking Bad in some ways. Like I would
Yeah.
have like characters like that, like Multiple Man. I still remember,
Except
and he
he
could like make
was
multiples of
fantastic
himself.
at
Yeah,
drawing.
he was so good. Backwardo. I see that and I think of young me. I'm like, geez, I'm
Oh
nothing
yeah,
compared to this.
Backwardo.
But yeah, so but I would make like little comics like that, and um, it's funny thinking about it because there's even like a sort of newspapery element to it of like writing about what these superheroes are doing, which is funny now because I'm a journalist. Obviously not in the business of like day to day news of superheroes and stuff, but I had never made that connection till right now. But so I was writing, and even later on as I was into elementary school and into yeah, especially elementary school, I would write stories based on books I like. Like I did like a whodunit sort of mystery where obviously the butler had to have done it. But I tried to make it like very obscure and make you think it wasn't the butler. And I had a friend read that. And he was like so surprised when it was the butler. I'm like, geez, you got to read more, dude. It's always a butler. Um, so I was doing a lot, just a lot of little writing and things there, and I really loved it when I was younger. So then, like, just fast forward to like first year of university, even a bit prior to that, when I know I'm like squarely in this fetish. I'm into it. I've been reading stories since 2011, pretty much. I've been hooked on those stories I've talked to you about at length, and
hmm
probably to like the boredom of everyone listening, like the Blood Monies, the Luckily Unluckies. These
The
stories are like
sadistics.
really, yeah, sadistic. So I'm reading all this, right, and then I get to a point where I'm like, you know what? Like I've told you to deal with sort of the anxieties of getting into university and that whole shift because I've never been good with change generally. And let me do some writing. It's always been a way to escape and things. Plus, I can probably do a good job at this. Maybe I hope, or maybe not. I'm scared of rejection, but it's a chance to sort of to see it and be creative and maybe write something fun and have fun because I always want to write and maybe everyone will love me if I do it. All this stuff, right? So many factors. And then yeah, of course, it's like being able to RP a little bit was a slow process for me. Hopping in the chat room of Lucky Fish forums back when that was a thing, and just writing and like taking what I've learned from like Stephen King's and all these stories I've read, and like I'm knocking people's socks off in see again another old timey expression. On these RP like channels on Lucky Fish forums just because I'm being detailed and I'm being like very descriptive with wedgies and people are like writing like a couple sentences and I'm writing like whole graphs describing like the metaphors of like the roses on this character's underwear and how that connects to love they're feeling and like just like beginner sort of stuff but like people are like wow you're so good in these RP channels and I'm sitting here like wow people like me I'm good I should write more so then, obviously, when on the Lucy and Daniela podcast, I spoke to you about Bob Rob making that post. So at
hmm
that point, like he makes the story poll, and I end up inadvertently being inspired to write Lucy and Daniela. So at that point, I'm pretty primed for it with all these like external factors and this own internal like confidence that's been building within me. So I really dive into it with Lucy and Daniela, and I've been hooked ever since in a lot of ways.
Yeah, does it, I like that you brought up comics, like you made comics when you were younger, because I also did
Yeah,
that.
amazing. That's great.
Nice little parallel there.
Yeah. And it's because I grew up reading some of them. Like, my dad had, like, this whole box full of, like, DC and Marvel comics, and I read a bunch of those. And
hmm
I still remember the ridiculousness of some of those ones, like the Superman villain who was only defeated if you said his name backwards and stuff. And it's
Yes, I
only
know
in
him. I
more
know who you're talking
yeah,
about.
Mr. Mix-a-Flix-a-Flix or
Yeah,
whatever,
whatever
right?
the fuck his name
I
is.
apologize to all the DC fans who are like, man, Hans Gutherson last down. But I mean, like, I only in more recent years got into like the classic stuff, like the Frank Millers. Like, I just actually yesterday I think like was skimming through the Dark Knight Returns, which I've read a couple times now,
hmm
and I was going through that the amazing Batman graphic novel and getting into stuff like that. So Yeah, it's funny, and I've thought like if only I knew how to draw and I was any good at it, I could write like really cool, um, like wedgie graphic novels or comics. But that's a lot of work, and you gotta be a really good artist, and it's one of the many things I am not, unfortunately.
That's okay. That's why we have famous um, famous artists that we can commission
Yeah,
for those kinds of
I
things.
hope to have some more art on my page too. Spoiler alert! News for all my fans. I'm working on something from an artist who's really good, and I guess I'm just waiting for them to finish the piece. So,
Eh,
spoiler alert.
maybe at some point I'll have art of my own. Who knows? What are your inspirations?
Wow, that's a lot. That's a long list. Definitely outside of the community, there's a lot of writers who stand out, but Stephen King's probably the easiest for me. I see a lot of like the way he writes. I try to emulate that and am inspired by. Big time. And obviously, some of his books, like The Stand, I think is one of the probably the best book ever written. Period. And then
Wow,
inside the community, yeah, it's amazing. Everybody should read The Stand.
I will
It's like
argue with
the
that.
yeah, and that's good. I think and that's good. But there's obviously books like I think everyone needs to read in this world. Like The Grapes of Wrath is critical, and ones
1984.
like that. Yeah, 1984 is good. I know AP was selling it out. He knows the high school curriculum,
Eh,
which is fair, but it's also a classic book
yes,
and one that is worth reading. And it's
one of
funny
the
because
best.
we have like what we did. We used to like back when we were newer in our friendship. We started and now we're like tight as thieves.
Thick as
We
thieves.
started like a Google Doc. Yeah, but I don't want to be cliche. Cliche is fine. So I'm changing up slightly. We started a Google Doc, and I did like a little passage where someone was getting a wedgie, and I talked about how brutal it was, and I threw in some metaphor about like the 2 minute hate and how that was, and AP loved it, and I was like, yay, 1984, good for
Yeah.
wedgie stories too. Um, but yeah, no, there's so many. Like, I don't know if 1984 makes my list, but these dystopian novels are definitely so key, and they're a reason like they're a staple in high schools, right? Because they show us what the world can be and how we have the power to change it.
Yes.
Um, so that's key. But there's so many great books there. But within the community is obviously like the Anti Cherries, Nicely Done, Cosby reruns, and the list sort of goes on from there. I know I've chatted with you about my favorites a couple times, and if we get an episode out about a bunch of our favorite stories, you'll hear me dive in and praise them emphatically. But I'm also working hard to find new inspirations too, like Anime Panties when he started. Obviously, I like I've said, he's the one writer weirdly like I get very jealous of and envious of. Like whenever he writes something or he's successful, like oh, Anime Panties. But it's this competition thing, and it's also like my own deeper anxiety of being like I know this guy so well and like look at how good he's doing, and it makes me very proud and happy. Obviously, his success is my success. I think it's because we're such good friends. So, but even newer writers, like I'm finding stuff all the time that I think is great, and it keeps pushing me to try and be better, and even ones that aren't as active now, like Bizarre Atomic and things, and obviously guys like Refreshing Lemonade and things. These really, really talented artists who haven't weren't around when I was coming up in the community, but are really just like innovating and bringing such new stuff to the community. I think it's inspiring.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, there's quite a bit to look to be inspired.
Yeah, definitely. And it's tricky because on DA, for example, there's so much new talent always
Yes.
coming up, and I can be faving stuff, but then if I have to think like, wait, what was that story I read last month that
Yep.
was really good by that new writer? When you have like 20 new stories that you've read or stories you think, oh, that title's really great, but when you read it, you're like, oh, I don't know about that, but even newer writers or just ones who seem newer just because they've been doing like captions like the atomic equation or something on DA or things or there are some new writers who I've been tracking and keeping an eye on to see what they do, and it's good. But yeah, the point is there's so much, and it's not hard to find more inspiration and ideas of how to do new things. And then at the same time, my goal is to try and be an inspiration to other people. So contests and doing really bizarre things like when I did the lipogram, which no one else, probably for good reason, has ever tried to do. Um, to just show people like, yeah, you can do a lot of crazy stuff with this fetish.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I guess you brushed on it a little bit. You kind of almost said the exact question that I was going to ask next. What drives your passion for this community? And this really, I think this really is the question that I want to know the most.
Yeah, and it's a great question. I think a fundamental one to understanding me and
Yes.
understanding so much about any human being. So for me, it's multifold, and a lot goes into it. I think. Partly it's a selfish desire. I'll be honest. To sort of be remembered, to be immemorialized. It's been argued that the reason we do things in general is to sort of be immortalized and be remembered, and we want to live on after we die. So if that's the case, then yeah, I write because I want for people to remember me and to know my name, and like when I die to have meant something, so to speak. So that's partly it. It's also the idea that I want to be a part of something. I want to belong, and in the community, I've found that belonging, and I've been able to like make something of myself too. So again, kind of selfish, in that I've been able to be like, I'm now quote unquote the community pillar, and I like to joke that's because you can hang the nerds from me. But
I've never heard that before.
yeah, that'll go in my wedgie rap if I ever do end up learning how to rap to a beat. That'll be one of the bars I spit. Um, so partly it's again it's selfish, and even that takes on different forms. At the same time, it's it's having seen what others can do. Like when we talk about inspirations, it's seeing what great stories anime panties, the anti cherries have written, and thinking to myself about the me who's always been into reading and always been inspired to write and express myself that way. It's thinking, what can I do that's different? It's wanting to express myself. I think creatively is a drive as well, big time for me. And then I think to sort of cap it off, it's also this idea that like I know what it's like to feel alone, to feel different, to feel shame, like all these things that fetishes go through, to know what it's like to not be able to say the word because you're so used to hiding it, like all the stuff that like I understand and I want and I feel like I need to in some ways help people know they're not alone. That's why my stories even from the beginning have tried to hit on more emotions and more different feelings and themes than just like and she got a wedgie and it was hot and it was like what's this deeper message that I want to try to communicate. So I hope that sort of answers the question. I'm not afraid to say or tell you that there is the selfish aspect of it that I assume most writers experience when they want to be creative and they want to sort of put something of themselves out there. They want the external validation, and I know I've spoken to you about that before. I definitely
Hmm.
crave that, and I've found that in the community, in some cases, it can be a really good place to get it to feel like belonging and community. But also, yeah, it's more wanting to help build something, and after having built it, wanting to support it and help others create a big community and something that really means something. It's wanting to professionalize it in some ways too. It's why I'm so eager to hop on podcasts to make people realize like, yeah, we're not just a bunch of people who are here to jerk off. Like that's a part of it, but there's deeper aspects and insights in the community that really make it a community and all that entails and what it means for us to be able to improve upon it, to form it into a business sort of, but also like more than that as well. So I hope that kind of answers your question. Uh, I think that gives you some insight into why I started doing this like a decade ago and have tried to be very prolific and active in the last like 10 years now at this point, which is crazy to think about.
Yeah. And you talked at length about the writing aspect of it, but I mean, you're
Yeah.
not just a writer, you're a podcast
Hmm.
host, you're a contest sponsor, I guess. You've
Yep.
done all of these like major things that have started trends for
Yep.
and created waves in the community, and
Yeah.
that really is what like I'm that's the thing I'm most curious about is why. That's what I wanted to. That's really what I wanted to know. So I'm,
Yeah.
and I think you can sort of apply that same sort of that same answer
Totally.
to
Yeah. Totally.
the
I
other
wanna
aspects.
onto the like as part of the sort of selfish part of it is like I wanna be in some ways considered the best. Although I don't ever want to come out and be like I'm the best.
You
I
are
want
the
people to say,
best.
look at that Hans Gutherson guy. Not only did he start a podcast trend that inspired three other people to make podcasts, but he commissioned this art. He's got this many watchers. He's put content everywhere that wedgie fetishists are, and he's well known around the community. All hail Hans Gutherson! Get the parade out! Like I want that, right? Like I want it
Yeah.
selfishly. As I think anybody who's going to spend time, especially if you're like me and you're kind of stupid, and you go, I'm not going to charge anybody for like a 80,000 word novel, or I'm gonna co-write this novel with Shadow, and I'm not gonna charge anybody for it. Like if you're gonna not do any of that, which is kind of foolish when you think about it. And yeah, like a big part of it is like I want people to be like, man, that Hans Gutherson guy, he's great, he's an inspiration to me, like all that. And I know it sounds selfish, and I'm sorry, but that's
Don't
partly
apologize.
that's partly it. And then it does go deeper because a part of me is like I'm not even thinking about that at all when I'm writing sometimes. And it's
Yeah.
just like I want to innovate. Like I want to see how far I can push things, and I want to write a lipogram where I never use the letter E when wedgie has two E's in the word.
Yep.
Like who does that? What maniac would do some strange bizarre thing like that? Me, because I'm like I want to show like things can be whatever. Like you can experiment and
You
try
want to
different
push the
things.
boundaries.
Exactly. So that's
Yeah.
always been my sort of thing. I've never been super thoughtful or like I've been more impulsive when I sort of do things like oh this might be cool experiment, and I can just sort of try it, and I've done it with things, and the contests were part of that. I came up competing in like an early contest by Ryukun.
Oh shit,
I
that's a
think that
name
was
I
his
completely
name.
forgot about.
Yeah, yeah, that was him. He did like an Erica contest,
I don't
I
know about the
think.
contest. It's just a
Uh,
name that I have not heard in
Yeah,
years.
yeah, he did an early one, and I competed in that, and that was one of the first things I did on DA. But I didn't win, but I got like an honorable mention. So I'm in good company. Anybody, if you ever don't win a contest, don't worry about it. It happens. That was me. You're in good company. Um,
Yep.
so yeah, like so all that stuff, podcasts, like you mentioned. I've commissioned videos now. I've been a financial producer on Dodo Birds videos. Like I try to do so much stuff so that like I can help push the boundaries of the community, but really inspire others to do it. Because it's what I've said to you, and I believe incredibly strongly. It's that I'm not the best in the community, not in any form, not as a writer, because there's better writers who you read their stuff. You're like, these guys should be writing professionally. I'm not the guy who's gonna make a bunch of videos and be like the Patreon god that like a JR is or something. But I can maybe inspire people. Like I feel like talking to JR when I did was a big part of
Yes.
him launching the Patreon and getting into it. Nicely done, the very talented artist. I He was sort of in retirement, right? Pretty much retired until I interviewed him, and now he's a ridiculously popular artist on DA. So like, I'm just glad to be a part of these things, and I'm driven by the idea of like, what more can we do as a community? What more can I do to inspire people and see what else we can do in this community? We have visual novels. what I've done a bit of interactive stories, but I'm always thinking like I want to be the first to do this new thing, and what else can we do?
Yeah. I mean, it's as simple as me saying Lucy and Daniela, and you automatically are the best to me.
Thank you.
And if you're curious about that, you can check out the 2 Lucy Danielle episodes to hear me completely. Yeah, I just listen to them if you're curious about my opinion on Lucy Daniela. Do you have a favorite story writer?
Man, that's so tricky. That's so tough. I'll probably say Auntie Cherry. Like, he's somebody, like, luckily unlucky, I named with you as my favorite episode, like, favorite story, sorry, of all time. And I think really because Auntie Cherry got what I've, from the very beginning, worked to sort of capture in my stories, which is like what it means to be a fetishist, what that experience is like, and not the human condition, but the wedgie fetishist condition. So I think the title has to go to him as my sort of favorite, and a story's got to be probably Luckily Unlucky. Like, I love Blood Money, and I think it's so well written, and it's beautiful, and that ending, every time I look at it, gives me chills because it's so good and so nice. But I mean, if I was to show like any story to like aliens and say like this is the fetish, and aliens even being other human beings, like because that's how they are to us in some ways, I would point to Luckily Unlucky and say like, yeah, this is something of who we are captured in story form for you to understand us. But yeah, he's written everything he wrote is exceptional, and so much of it is so seminal to the community. So definitely a huge inspiration to me, and I've tried to get him on the podcast because he's still active, just not writing as much. Like he's around. So one day I hope to talk to my hero.
Yeah.
About how he is so amazing. And I've done Q&A with him. For anybody interested, I did do a Q&A with him years back, and I've shared that a few times. It's on DA, so you can check out some insights from him about what it means to be the best ever. Although he, again, is very humble, which is great. But yeah, I'd probably give it to him and Luckily Unlucky.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I can't fault you for that. It's Luckily Unlucky is got to be, despite the fact that it's unfinished, it's got to be a close second to Lucy and Daniela.
Yeah, it's so good. Man, I wish it was finished.
So do I.
He was just getting into such hot stuff with the
my god,
classmate. The classmate whose name might have been Tara. I can't entirely remember. She was incredibly hot. Hotter than the sex goddess.
No, the goddess was hot as hell.
Yeah, but this friend who was just
no, she wasn't. I can tell you right now, no, she wasn't.
No, but she was. It's
no,
bizarre,
she wasn't.
Like, how hot he wrote her. Because I mean, like, she's this very playful, very like sort of meaning to be, but also not sort of meaning to be, like sexual sort of friend who's just like joking about giving her wedgies and stuff. And I mean, that's great. It was so awesome. So I mean, he's just getting into it with that and all this stuff. I mean, didn't one of the characters go back to high school or something? And he, like, brutally wedgied
that was that was the final part.
Yeah, that was Jen, I think.
Yep. Yeah, we're gonna have to do an episode on that, on Luckily Unlucky.
Yeah. Oh, of course. It's amazing. So I mean, he was getting into all this crazy stuff, and then so many amazing stories.
But so realistic at the same time.
It is, absolutely. From the very beginnings of that story, I read that and I go like, yeah, this is how I felt. This is how it is to be afraid, and even how the humor he brings to it in some cases, where he talks about like missing a chance to give the hot new friend we met at Wedgie's, like all the wedgie fetishists in the world are like screaming or something. I'm like, yeah, like that's funny to me. Like that's great. So yeah, he's just a gift to the community.
I'll say this one thing on the story until we do an actual episode on it. He 100% captures what it's like to be a wedgie fetishist.
Yeah.
He does that.
Yeah. It's amazing. Yeah. It's amazing.
Yes. All right. How do you stay motivated to write? That
Wow,
is,
that's a
yeah.
good question. It ebbs and flows like with anybody. For me, I think it kind of goes back to what we're speaking about deeper influences. I will sometimes just have really ideas that are really driving, and I'll go, wow, I really want to write this. And what sometimes does it is, again, this selfish thing of like, oh, but if I don't write this, like, what if someone else does and they write this really cool story, and then they're popular, everybody loves them, and Hans Gutherson, who? They're gonna forget all about me. So
Nobody
that's what
will.
occasionally has helped a little bit, but really more than that, it's been after like a decade of doing this, it's trying to form some habits. It's trying to be a bit more writing frequently, so you get into a pattern of it. And I think it's allowing yourself to sort of write down whatever comes to your mind, like having like your phone by you. So if you have any idea, you can just sort of pop it in there. And I think that's really motivating because then I feel like for me, it's sort of taught my brain, like, yeah, I can just come up with thoughts and I can write stuff. Um, Obviously, at the moment, coming off of like Flame Over Darkness, I haven't been as active. I've been sort of giving myself a little break. But throughout the years, what's helped is trying to find different things that inspire me. Keeping active reading is a really big help because I see other people doing new things or writing stories, and I go like, oh yeah, I should. It reinvigorates the love of writing, I think. When you go back to those roots, the roots that I've had as someone who loves reading. If you've been sort of stressed about everything else and life, and we all know how life can get and how annoying, or if you're going through a tough period, as we all have, if you're not someone like me who sort of does therapy by writing about these things, like when I went through the infamous Hans breakup a little while ago that I hinted at, that really rocked me. I was able to write out of that in some ways. But if you're not, reading I find is a huge help because then you're inspired and you're thinking like, wow, this gives me a really cool idea. And watching new content, seeing movies, whatever sort of inspires you generally. If you don't know what that is, just check out new things, listen to music, and maybe something will click. Read some books, and you'll think like, yeah, this would be cool, but what if it had wedgies and stuff like that? And then obviously writing takes a tremendous amount of effort. It's not something that's often discussed in detail, but it really is like a huge. The ideas part, I think many writers would agree, is easy. You can just think of like something and it's there, but then putting that down to paper, especially if the story starts getting bigger, as some of mine does, it can be very tricky. But I still love it, which I think helps a lot. And I think that comes down to being active reading, being active checking out what's new, and thinking about stories a lot, and viewing it as a sort of like fun escape. Like I at this point I'm not seeing it like, oh, this is a job I have to do. So maybe that also helps me as well. Just never losing that sort of love of it that I've had. I'm trying to be specific and give actionable insights for people who want to find motivation. But I know how tricky that can be. I hope that maybe gave something to people in general. I guess my advice would be read the stories that you really like, the ones that sort of you enjoyed, and keep reading them. And eventually that will spark some deeper, I think, drive in you to go from reading to writing, and you're gonna be good at it. I think it's having some confidence too has helped me a bit. Like I know I mentioned the imposter syndrome, and that's definitely something I've struggled with. But after writing a fair bit, I've had to try and not get in the mindset of like I'm so great, anything I do people will love because I'm Hans Gutherson. That's something that like you gotta watch out for, because if you just write something bad, people aren't gonna like it, and then it's gonna be this terrible, terrible thing. So yeah, it's again a lot of different pieces for it for me to keep me motivated, but really to try and briefly sum up, it's wanting to continue innovating, wanting again being driven by that if we want to simplify it in the community. But that only gets you so far. It really is that sort of personal, like, I have these stories still, I have these ideas, and when I can, I want to, as much as possible, get it out there and share it, um, and see what the result is.
Nice. Very comprehensive answer. And I think there's a lot to glean from that can help people that are struggling to stay motivated.
I hope so. I hope so.
Yeah.
If not, hit me up. We'll give you a master class on writing.
You could definitely be the one to
I'll
do
try.
that.
I'll try at least. I'll do my best. I don't know if I'm a good teacher, but I will try.
So, as someone who's been in this community for at least a decade
Yeah.
and more, what do you think the community as a whole does well and what it could do better at?
Yeah. Yeah, I love these kinds of questions. I mean, obviously, I'll try to keep it relatively brief because I don't want to go on too long about fragmentation and these deeper trends that have sort of shifted what the community looks like. I'll sort of sum up by saying I think what we do well, I guess at our best, when we're really doing what we should be, we're good at supporting each other, promoting each other, creating friendships, and being a place where people can belong. I think that's the ideal and what really is good about this fetish. And I don't know how other fetishes are. Maybe our community is like, we rank at the bottom of Frank's fetish scale or whatever in terms of like friendliness and welcomeness, all this. Like, I have no idea how we rank or how we are compared to others, but I know in terms of how I feel every day being around, seeing new writers coming in, I feel like for the most part, there's a very welcoming aspect to the community. There's a belonging. There is in most places. You're able to try new things and experiment, and you're going to get people who like your stuff and give you some sort of response, even if that's as sort of minimal as a fave or like a brief comment saying they like it. So I think that's something that the community does well. There's a lot of ways we can improve, starting with underage content monitoring and avoiding that more. And as we discussed, you and I, the conversation is even shifting in some ways towards what about talking about content that's older and classic from older, very popular names that features underage characters? How do we address that? So figuring out the nuances around that is something we've never really done as a community, and I think going to introduce a whole new area of struggles for us, because it feels like it used to be a yearly thing, but it might become a bit less frequent, where very frequently there would be very heated debates all over about underage content and the old argument of like, yeah, but if you have a toy at a toy store, there's like a pervert who gets turned on by toys, that doesn't mean it's bad. You can put the toys there. It's like, yeah, but if you're writing for wedgie fetishists and that's who your audience is, you can't be putting kids and underage characters in a story, because inevitably they're going to be turning on people just because the wedgies are there. So I mean, that argument and the arguments come around kind of cyclically, so hopefully like we can get better at that. In terms of like, just also the hope is the community can continue growing and innovating. We can get better, I think, at having content that's easy to find and maybe centralized somewhere, like a library of stories that are from across the community, so we can learn from like what people on Wedgie Buddies are doing and what's going on with Reddit. Having some sort of like idea of what's happening community wide in a more like connected community, I think would be amazing. Um, Obviously, some people who don't care, don't know if they care, think they care about stuff like MM content or I don't know, whatever's going on Reddit, and they might not care for that as I would, but having like a large centralized hub for the community, I think would be a great way for us to learn from each other and really build up like the community in its fullest form. Plus, I want to see some more innovation. We're really good at innovating. Like I'd be well, not with feet, because feet is like I believe the most popular fetish. But I was gonna say, compared to others, I imagine us with like visual novels. Now a lot of videos, which are probably common, but I know like JR briefly talked about doing like ASMR content a while back with me, um, and things like interactive stories. I can't imagine every fetish is going to be that innovative in their approaches to content. I know Shadow and I hinted to you that we're sort of building a video game
Mm-hmm.
about Flame Over Darkness and tons of wild ideas, like a cookbook for Flame Over Darkness and stuff. Like, I mean, it's sort of fetishy, but also, and it would have little like in the cookbook specifically, it'd be like little throws to wedgies and things. But like, I can't. So I want to see more innovation. I think that's somewhere we can continuously, always, every day, try to do more of, push the boundaries. I want to see more experimentation. Like I keep harping on the lipogram I did and things, and some more experimental stuff I did. But seeing more of that, I think would be great as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that was all great. Um, so again, you've been in this community for over a decade, and so there's a lot of experience and things you can pull from. Are there any
Yeah,
trends you've noticed that have happened over the years?
totally, totally. Yeah, I think I've shared them with you before. I could probably find like the very detailed posts I've shared about trends among the community that I've sort of discerned once I got into thinking about these in like very concrete terms. But when it comes to trends, there's things like fragmentation is the first one that comes to mind. Obviously, for us who come up on Lucky Fish forums, we feel this
Mm-hmm.
constantly because
Mm-hmm.
we are on one site, right, where there's a ton of content, and for us, it's videos, it's true stories, which are active, it's art, it's pictures, it's basically everything, and even had a chat, like I said, a chat function, and you could talk with wedgie fetishists there live. It had basically everything a community could need to grow. So what we see in more recent years, and especially now with the board basically dead, is a fragmentation of the community, and I think that's has to do with a growing community, which is sort of another trend potentially. Um, but by fragmentation, I just mean we're so spread out now. We used to be on Lucky
Mm-hmm.
Fish forums, or is how many of us viewed it.
And
We
there
were
was an
probably
option
always,
to see unread posts, so you could see
yeah,
all of the content that was put out.
yes, that's a great point because what that
Yeah.
is a centralizing of information as well as the
Mm-hmm.
community. So it
Yeah.
is you were able to stay up to date.
Yeah. And
DA
there's so
obviously
much that we miss out
gives you
on with
updates.
DA. Like, there's
Exactly,
no way to know if
exactly,
somebody, like, if
exactly.
there's just a classic that's gone unnoticed.
Yeah, totally. No, it's exactly what I was gonna say. Yeah, DA will say, "Here's some new stuff." But if you're someone like me who has ended up watching like 900 people or something, there's no way to keep track of half of that. If even, like, even many of those people probably aren't creators, to be fair, but those that are, like, how do you keep track of all that? And say you're not watching them, there's a good chance they're going to fly totally under your radar. So, how active do you have to be in typing in Wedgie and DA and going through new stories and trying to figure out what's good and what's not. So obviously, and you're gonna miss a ton. And even if they're sharing in groups, there's a ton of wedgie groups on DA. So are you gonna miss their story anyway? Is the problem.
Right.
So fragmentation. We're now so spread out. We used to be Lucky Fish forums. Now we're DA. Now we're Reddit. Now we're Wattpad. Now we're Twitter, etc., etc.,
Instagram
etc.
used to
The list.
be.
Exactly. Instagram, TikTok now has fetishists on
Yep.
it. I guess mostly looking for content. I wasn't on Reddit for a while, but I've gotten on it. Wattpad, I just started to post Lucy and Daniela, and that's finding a new audience. So I'm trying to like keep an eye on it. Obviously, Wedgie Buddies is there, um, but even that MM community feels to have spread out from what used to be Wedgie Haven, where it was really big. So
Experience Project used to be
pretty
a big
pretty
thing as
wild.
well.
Yes, yeah,
As
experience project, but
toxic as it
now,
was.
yes, as wild as it was, there was like one good story on one of those sites recently.
I'm
So
pretty sure the only good
and now
story
we
on
have,
there was Zoe's Summer of Terror.
yeah, you're probably right. Yeah, so that's a big trend, definitely. Another one is writers are older now, and the community is older. I've mentioned to you many times now. In 2017, when I did the demographic survey, the majority of wedgie fetishists were white males between 16 and 20 years old. So that was 17. That's, I don't know math. Was that 5 years? So now we're all going to be much older, right? We're going to have different interests. We're going to have more practice, you would think, writing, better technology, and we're going to be able to innovate more. We're going to be able to do things like interactive stories easier, and we're going to probably, as writers, be tackling more adult themes, setting, and stories. So it's a real growing up of the community in a few ways, and I think we're seeing that with a lot of content, how mature it is, and a lot of the themes being tackled and things. Um, and also just in general, we've touched on this already, but on experimentation and innovation and the types of content we're putting out. If we think about early community days, back to Wedgie Girls onto Lucky Fish forums, it was videos and it was stories and it was art, but more and a lot of pictures. So those very basic sort of types of content. But nowadays, with Between Two Cheeks, who's gone, but with other creators coming up like Indoor Stereos, we're seeing innovation like polls and surveys to understand the community. We're seeing podcasts, which we didn't have years back, right? Visual novels, people making comics, like that Wedgie Wednesday one, which I'm not
Yeah.
personally, honestly, not a fan of,
I
but they're
fucking
doing it.
love it.
The art that they share is good, but if you're a subscriber to it,
Oh, that
like I've looked through all
magazine.
of those. Yeah, the
Oh,
e-zine as
I'm
they
not talking
call
about
it.
that.
Yeah,
I was talking about. I
yeah, I'm
thought you were
talking about the
talking.
e.
I thought you were talking about the Steve-O drawing, Wedgie
Oh, not the
Wednesday.
Steve O drawings
Yes,
with
that's
the
what I thought you were
obviously
talking. Yeah,
famous. Yeah,
that's the one that I love. I don't know
yeah, I'm
anything
talking about
about the
the
magazine.
yeah the EUF zine as they call it.
Yeah,
Honestly, I've looked through many of the files and I'm not honestly too impressed with what I've seen. Just because a lot of it is like they take images of like popular characters and just from like the Google or something, and they're not even like wedgie images. They just take like, I don't know, Danganronpa characters and they stick them in and they write like short, brief stories, but they're not even like, I don't know, top tier sort of stuff. And they do commission some cool art for the cover and stuff, but that's sort of the best parts of them. So I don't want to hate on them. I know they're trying hard work, and I shouldn't talk until I create my own magazine. And obviously, it's a lot of work. But I guess the point I was trying to make there is, we never had that before, right? Magazines, which in their case is a mix of like art sort of and images and text, and so this innovation in the community that and what we're creating, it's really really wild. So
yeah,
and funny to think too, like every year basically somebody outside of the community will write like some online piece and some news site about the fetish. They like, I don't know, discover us or something. So we get some piece where some randos from Twitter or something get interviewed about the fetish. And so if you Google like wedgie fetish, you'll find a bunch of these. So it's kind of interesting to think like there's a greater awareness of the fetish maybe thanks to these random articles. And I like to think a bunch of these trends we're talking about are inspiring writers to be more creative and try new things and and to look at it more professionally. Um, and I guess the last trend to end off on is monetization. We didn't really have this beyond video creators, and the interesting trend there is that back in 2011 or more recently, it was these major studios making all the videos,
Clips for
and
sale.
they had a certain, yeah, exactly, clips for sale, which is still popping to this day.
Mm-hmm.
But they have a very specific business model around. They would put out the video and people would buy it, and that's that. Nowadays, with like JR's Patreon, they made a conscious decision, obviously, to crowdfund it that way, to crowdfund all the content, but also get a lot of input,
Mm-hmm.
the community. So, and obviously JR being a fetishist, it makes it from the ground up this made by fetishists, wedgie fetishists, for wedgie fetishists
Yes.
process, which is a very interesting shift there. And then obviously monetization spreads out. Seeing his success, we're seeing a lot more Patreon creators, including the Wedgie Wednesday EUF zine, which to their credit has 111 patrons. So I shouldn't be complaining about what they do over there. Um,
You're still
and things
allowed to,
like
though.
AP and I launching our Patreon, which was incredibly successful and had was, I believe, and I would argue, the first and only Patreon to have a variety of content, including art, stories, videos, different sort of
Oh
posts from
man.
other writers that we commissioned. So we did that to great success.
I
Um,
have a question for
Another
you when you're
writers
done with
buying
this.
it.
When you're done
Yeah,
with
no,
your
please.
answer
Yeah. But Cecita,
about
like
that.
making his book, right? That you
Right.
really enjoyed. I Could Change
Yes.
Her,
Yes, and that's
and
something that I
selling
want to
that.
talk
So
about.
monetization is being a trend too. So I know that's a ton to cover, but I think those are the big ones I've sort of shared before that have been on my mind, and I think will continue to shape the community
Yes.
going forward.
Yeah, and I knew you had a lot of just for the fact that you've been in this community and active the entire time for so long. I knew you had really good insights, and that was all that was all gold. Like I think I sort of already knew it just talking to you, from kind of piecing together things that you said from previous podcasts, and just knowing you on a personal level. And I kind of knew these things, but um, it's yeah the what I get out of everything you said is that the community has only gone in a good direction.
Mm. Yeah, I think so. I think we've gotten better at also figuring out what's bad.
Yes.
Obviously, Lucky Fish forums, and you and I have spoken about this, but Lucky
Mm-hmm.
Fish forums, from the get go, it was very clear. Like, if you stepped out of line, if you shared underage art, if you weren't friendly, you'd get kicked.
Mm-hmm.
DA obviously doesn't have that sort of direct, very quick community commitment, so to speak. That's not the word I'm looking for, but the point is there. Like, you can
Understanding.
report someone for doing something bad, but are they going to get kicked right away? Or are they just going to start another account and do the same thing, which I
Is
guess could
anything even
happen on
gonna
Lucky Fish
happen?
forums. Exactly. Is anything even going to happen? We knew on Lucky Fish forums, Lucky was going to
Yeah.
kick you. That was it. He was
Yep.
going to bring the hammer down, and he was
Yep.
very proud about bringing the hammer down on people.
Yeah.
Same thing with like Wedgie Buddies. Is stuff gonna happen there? I don't know. Wedgie Haven, if you look back at that site, they had some issues with underage content. Things like Reddit. Again, I don't know. Wattpad. I feel like there's a lot there where it's very experienced project like in that there's underage content on Wattpad and things. So yeah, we don't know, but I feel like on DA, especially all the big names that matter, the ones who have all the watchers, it seems to be, but I could be wrong. Correct me if there's some standouts, but it feels like we're united in standing up against things like underage content and making it clear to people when we see it, like, that's not appropriate. Don't do that. Be nice to each other. We're trying to build a community here. So I feel like where we can, the community has generally been moving in a positive
Yes.
direction with all of that. There's going to be stuff that I guess is going to be very difficult for us to ever control or stop. We're probably always going to have those young fetishists who don't know about DA, Lucky Fish, whatever, who end up on Twitter and who see someone post about wedgies, like the young Hans Guthersons on chess.com, where what's a wedgie, and like mining for content from these people who make one post about it and spam them um,
Mm-hmm.
in unholy ways and things. So I mean, there might be some stuff I don't know yet how we can deal with all that, unless we somehow find a way of drawing again community members to some hub of a site where so many good principles for being like for not being inappropriate maybe exist. I don't know. But I like to think that yeah, we've been moving in a positive direction, especially when we think about it from a content angle and we talk about innovation and even fragmentation in some ways is a positive thing. You could say like, yeah, it's much harder to keep track of content, but on Lucky Fish forums, you can't have content, right? And for
You
some
can
people
for
who are
you have been able to for a couple of years now.
no, not MM. MM is
Yes.
still pretty off the. You could have
Yes.
FM. They only just launched that section, which might be what you're thinking of. They launched that like a couple years back, so you could have guys in stories. Period. If you look at Lucky Fish forums throughout its history, people have tried to write MM stories, and they've been pretty much like, no, this is for female wedgies, and that's happened multiple times. So that's one aspect of it. Um, Obviously you get great content on there, and people who don't want stories, that's great for them, right? They're sort of protected from it. I say that with quotation marks, but I mean for gay wedgie fetishists, for example, or people who just want to see stories, you can't find that there on Lucky Fish forums, so you got to go somewhere else. So having so many different places is a boon in some ways. No matter what, you're going to be able to find a place with the content you want, is the hope, because there seems to be, as we've said, just and we see with Indoor Stereos sharing with us some insights he did from scraping DA's data, that there's been an explosion in content, wedgie content. Um, Although we still don't entirely know what that looks like, if that's just status updates. Maybe all the vanilla people in the world are talking about wedgies for some reason because the pandemic has caused wedgies. I don't know, but
I'm
the
sure you'd
hope
love
is
that.
yeah, that'd be great. What a cool story that would be. What a cool trend that would be. But the hope is there's a lot of just creators on DA, and we're seeing them all the time. New writers coming up with different stories, and with stuff on all these other sites we mentioned. No matter what you're into, you're never gonna be like, "Wow, I don't see this content that I want, and I can't get off." Right? We don't want that for people, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I think everybody should be able to get off to the content they want. And maybe if there's just some kind of directory that we can like that categorizes like
Yeah.
this is for female, this has male people in it,
Yeah.
this is content, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I did talk about that a little bit with AP.
I'm so
And I
excited for
think
part two of that podcast.
I
Oh
think
man.
well, by the time you're listening to this, that episode will have been out a week already. So, but anyway, I think this next question kind of goes hand in hand with that. Is there anything you don't think is getting the attention and recognition it deserves?
Wow, that's tricky. I mean, the fall of Lucky Fetish makes me sad. I've been trying after I basically moved everybody off of Lucky Fish forums because I thought DA was cool and I thought we could get on there. I now want everybody back on Lucky Fish forums, so I'm like trying to push that. But I mean, people see DA and they see, especially nowadays, how many faves you can get, all these crazy high view numbers that some people suspect might be inflated, but we don't know, so maybe not. They see that and they go, "Yeah, I'm not going back to Lucky Fish forums where I get 1,000 views and no comments on a story," which is fair, and I understand it. And it's not as easy. There's not obviously the same level of content coming out. So like, I think my point here is like I want greater awareness of the history of the community and these aspects of it that people don't know. I sort of unfairly hope and expect people to be experts in the community's history. Um, and so I've gotten upset when like people are like, "You've done a podcast with Bloom225, the amazing artist and rare." I'm like, "Oh yes, I did. You should know everything I've ever done. You should know all this stuff. That's great. You should know who did this and who did that." So generally, history of the community, I think, awareness of like what's going on different sites, Um, detail, like I want people to share insights that are like thought out and like evidence based about the community, and like I really want people to be sharing like very specific thoughts on like when the Renaissance is. Like I want attention paid to sort of like what the community means from an almost more academic standpoint, as academic as we can sort of get, um, without being academics ourselves, really. Um, if that makes sense at all. So,
Yeah.
plus, yeah, like always going to want to see less underage content, ideally no underage content.
Yeah.
Now I
Yep.
guess for me, that's sort of at the moment taking the form of like, what do we do about our heroes like Auburn Ink, who had some Hinata Naruto art, which features characters who in canon are underage. How do we address that nowadays when we want to highlight that they are very talented artists who've done a lot and obviously were there for the beginnings of our fetish for a lot of us. So figuring out that, trying to say like, yeah, they were good, and they still are good, and they mean a lot, but what they did is still problematic. Being able to call that out and figure out how to do that, while still recognizing like, yeah, they're great, just what they did is not good, and that needs to be addressed. So figuring out all that is something I think needs a bit more attention to.
Hmm. Yeah, I like all that. Yeah, it's. I guess yeah, the big thing that I can talk on is just continually addressing underage content and making just
Yeah,
hammering it home because I don't think there is ever enough um, people or posts or whatever reminding people and hammering home why it's not okay to have underage content.
yeah, exactly.
So going along with that, are there any untapped areas the community could expand to?
Yeah, I mentioned academic studies, and although it sounds probably super boring and wedgie fetishists everywhere, probably like, but we're here to get turned on. Why are we writing essays about a community? I think that would be, to me, is something I'm interested in. And as I mentioned, I've started writing like an essay on sort of the psychology of a wedgie fetishist. Most likely, it'll be a more general like how a fetish, what a fetish is, how it develops sort of essay, because obviously, as you can imagine, there's no literature on wedgie fetishists in general. Um, so something like that I think would be cool. I'd love to just see more experimentation with different things, like more lipograms, more poetry, things that you don't really expect in a community where one of the main goals of content creators is to turn on their audience. So trying things like poetry and things that aren't obvious turn-ons as much so as like a video, which we know the male brain especially is more wired to be stimulated by visuals. So if we do different things, if we do different visual novels and things, if we do comics, if we experiment with these things that aren't as common, I think that's only going to be a huge plus to the community, what we are doing